5 masked figures blended into the crowd at Arlington, their eyes fixed on the tomb guard, hands buried under dark coats. They moved like predators, silent and synchronized, prepared to strike. To the onlookers, it was only a solemn ritual, a soldier's measured march. But to those men, it was a mission. They had no idea who they were about to confront. Corporal James Whitaker, the sentinel on duty, stood unmoving, his rifle aligned perfectly, his gaze locked on the horizon. For the visitors, he was part of the ceremony. For the intruders, he was a barrier. What they didn't realize, what no one could imagine, was that this soldier in immaculate dress blues had stared death in Afghanistan, carried a wounded brother through flames, and sworn to guard this ground at any cost. Within half a minute, they would learn exactly what a tomb guard could do, and Arlington would remember. Before we step into the story, tell us, where are you watching from? Share it in the comments. And if you still believe honor, sacrifice, and courage matter, stand with us in preserving their memory. The October sun dipped low above Arlington National Cemetery, Virginia, casting a golden light across endless rows of white stones, each one a silent echo of sacrifice. The air carried a crisp chill, touched by the whisper of autumn leaves and the distant hum of a city that felt far removed. At the tomb of the unknown soldier, people gathered in reverence, their voices subdued in the sacred calm. Veterans with lined faces, families guiding wheelchairs, and couples hand in hand stood united before the marble monument that immortalized those who gave all without a name. The steady rhythm of a sentinel's footsteps echoed like a heartbeat in the stillness, linking this moment to a century of duty. Corporal James Whitaker, 29, a white soldier from Ohio, stood watch. His uniform was spotless, every crease razor-sharp, each button polished to a shine. His M14 rifle rested at the exact angle across his chest. His boots gleamed, and his stare held forward, unshaken as the stone behind him. To the crowd. To them he was part of the ritual, a living emblem of discipline. Yet James was no statue. He had served in Afghanistan, trudging through dust and fire, and there he lost his closest friend, Sergeant Daniel Carter, to a roadside bomb in Kabul. The blast left a scar etched on his shoulder and a deeper one carved in his heart. Determined, he joined the old guard, enduring relentless training to become a sentinel of the unknown, keeping a promise to Daniel and to every soldier whose name had vanished with time. Each step, each precise turn was an act of loyalty, a pledge to safeguard their memory. In the audience stood Eleanor Davis, 68, once an army nurse during the Vietnam War. Her hands, once steady in field hospitals, now shook slightly as they leaned on her cane, her gaze fixed on James. In him, she saw the same young men she once dressed in bandages, the ones who laughed through agony, and the ones who never came home. At her side was Walter Hayes, 75, a Marine veteran of Korea. His service cap rested proudly on his head. He had come to Arlington to honor comrades laid to rest here, their faces still sharp in his memory after 6 decades. Other visitors, grandparents, former soldiers, families, stood in hushed respect, some softly speaking of the tomb's history, first dedicated in 1921 to honor for the unknown dead of World War I, later expanded to include Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The weight of those battles lingered in the atmosphere, a collective memory carried by those who had lived them. But not everyone present came to honor the fallen. Near the chain barrier, 5 figures stood apart, black masks pulled tight, their eyes cold and focused. They weren't tourists or grieving families. They were trained operatives from the Middle East, tied to a shadowy network already tracked by intelligence services. Their mission was clear: to strike at this American symbol, desecrate its sanctity, and deliver a message. Their leader, tall with a scar above his mask, surveyed the scene with predatory precision. His men shifted subtly, placing themselves with military discipline, each covering a line of approach, each step calculated. Every motion was rehearsed. They believed they could desecrate this sacred ground in moments. James saw them. His head did not turn. Protocol required his eyes locked forward, but his instincts, sharpened in Afghan valleys, screamed. He had noticed threats before, insurgents blending in with markets, their movements too precise to be chance. These men were the same. Their spacing, their efforts to avoid the hidden cameras, their hands hovering near their coats, it was the rhythm of an ambush. His pulse stayed steady, his grip on the rifle unyielding. The sentinel's creed demanded composure, but his mind worked fast, charting their angles, predicting their move. Eleanor noticed too. In Vietnam, she had seen the tension before chaos erupted, the way bodies move before the first shot. These aren't mourners, she thought, tightening her grip on her cane. Walter caught her look, his own instincts flaring. He had survived ambushes in Korea, knew the stance of men on a mission. "They're not here to pay respect," he murmured to Eleanor. "They're here for trouble." The crowd stayed oblivious, caught in the rhythm of James's measured march, the solemn grace of the ritual. A few veterans whispered about the tomb's meaning, how it represented every soldier who never returned. Their memories carved in stone and silence. The assault began with one deliberate act. The leader stepped forward, letting a handkerchief slip just past the chain barrier. "Apologies," he said, his voice smooth, tinged with a faint accent, loud enough for all to hear. "Dropped my handkerchief. Mind if I take it?" He didn't wait for permission. Crossing the chain with fluid confidence, he tested James's restraint. The spectators stirred, some merely curious, others uneasy. James didn't flinch, didn't blink. His discipline anchored him like iron, though every fiber in his body was taut, ready for the next move. That was the cue. The other four shifted instantly, spreading out with precision to encircle the post. One drifted to his left, another to his right. A third slipped behind him, while the fourth edged closer to the crowd, set to spark chaos. Below Arlington's visitor center, in the control room, Captain Margaret Lee monitored the screens. The cemetery surveillance network, equipped with facial recognition, had already flagged two of the intruders as known operatives minutes earlier. Priority 1, she spoke into her headset, her tone calm but urgent. 5 suspects at the tomb, coordinated assault. Immediate response team, move now. The leader bent as if to retrieve the handkerchief, then snapped upright, a dagger sliding from his sleeve. He struck forward, aiming for James's arm to knock the rifle free. At the same instant, the man on his left lunged for the M14, fingers grazing the stock. From behind, another swung a collapsible baton toward James's spine. The attacker on the right lashed out with a swift, low kick, sharp and calculated to take him down. The fifth shouted in Arabic, a harsh command meant to sow panic, his voice scattering the crowd. Gasps broke out, some people stumbling away, others frozen in shock. Eleanor's pulse hammered, her cane digging into the ground for steadiness. Walter's hand curled into a fist, old Marine instincts urging him to fight, but he knew this was James's test. In those 40 seconds, everything shifted. James acted without pause. The instant steel scraped against his rifle, he moved. The sentinel's code permitted defense once the post was under attack, and that threshold had been crossed. With a seamless motion, he drove the butt of his M14 into the leader's wrist. The sharp crack echoed across the marble. The dagger flew, skidding across the stone as the leader stumbled back, clutching his arm. The assailant grabbing for the rifle was next. James pivoted sharply, slamming his elbow into the man's chest, dropping him breathless to the ground. The baton from behind grazed his shoulder, stinging, but James used the man's momentum against him, twisting and sending him crashing hard to the floor. The kicker came faster, his leg cutting through the air, but James anticipated it. He shifted aside, letting the man's speed carry him forward, and James hooked his boot behind the man's knee, sending him crashing onto the marble. The fifth assailant, still yelling, lunged with a small blade flashing in his hand. James met him head-on, slamming a controlled shoulder into his chest, knocking him off balance as the knife clattered away. Every strike was clean, deliberate, the product of years spent in battlefields where hesitation meant death. James had hauled wounded comrades through firefights, held positions under mortar fire, and learned that survival demanded calm precision. These men were skilled and lethal, but James was forged into something more, a soldier hardened by loss, standing in defense of those who could not. Around him, the crowd dissolved into panic and awe. A woman screamed, clutching her husband's arm. A veteran in a wheelchair gripped the frame tightly, his eyes wide with recognition. Eleanor stood frozen, breath shallow, seeing in James the echoes of Vietnam's young soldiers. Men who fought not for glory but because duty required it. Walter's voice broke softly, almost reverent. "That's training," he murmured. "That's what it takes." In the command center, Captain Lee's monitors captured every angle. The system had traced the intruders' movements, their synchronized advance triggering alerts even before the first strike. "Immediate action team, 10 seconds out," she said firmly, her hand steady over the controls. She had witnessed threats before, but the speed of this assault was unlike anything. The rapid response team burst through a side gate moments later. Four officers in tactical gear advanced with practiced precision. They descended on the attackers before the audience could even process what was happening. The leader, still clutching his broken wrist, was zip-tied within moments. The baton wielder tried to crawl away but was slammed to the ground. The kicker and the rifle grabber gave up instantly, their bravado gone. The fifth man, the shouter, tried to flee, his footing slipping as he ran. An officer caught him near the chain barrier, tackling him hard, the collision drawing a collective gasp from the crowd. From the moment the leader crossed the chain to the final zip tie, just 40 seconds had passed. 40 seconds in which James Whitaker had held his ground. James returned to position. His uniform was marked, a thin cut across his hand where the dagger grazed him, a bruise forming on his shoulder from the baton strike. Yet his rifle rested once more at its precise angle, his boots set exactly as before. His face remained calm, his gaze steady on the horizon, as though nothing had happened. To the onlookers, he was still the sentinel, but now they understood the truth. He was more than a symbol in a ritual. He was a warrior, a guardian of the fallen, a man who had stood against 5 trained attackers without yielding. The silence that followed was heavy, sacred, the kind that settles over a battlefield or a cathedral when history turns. Eleanor's eyes shone, not from fear, but from pride. She had seen men like James in the storms of war, holding their post when all seemed lost. She stepped forward, her cane tapping softly, and laid a single white rose at the base of the barrier. "For my husband," she whispered. "And for you, young man." She looked at James, knowing he would not reply, but feeling a bond that needed no words. Walter watched, his jaw set, then turned to nearby veterans. "That boy carries the heart of every soldier resting here," he said, gesturing toward the sea of headstones. He stood for them all. Around them, the crowd began to murmur, their voices hushed but filled with meaning. A man in a navy cap, his hands scarred from years at sea, leaned toward his wife. "Did you see how he moved? Not a step wasted, like he was born for it." His wife nodded, her gaze still fixed on James. "That's the kind of thing you don't find in books," she said softly. "That's duty." Nearby, a woman in her 70s, hair neatly pinned beneath a scarf, clutched her purse as memories stirred, her brother lost in Vietnam. She visited Arlington every year, but today felt different. Today, she had watched the tomb defended not just by ritual, but by courage. The attackers were dragged away, their masks stripped, revealing faces hardened by years of conflict yet dulled now by defeat. The fifth man, the shouter, sat slumped in the security van, his head bowed. "We didn't know," he muttered faintly. "We thought it was only a monument." The officer fastening restraints said nothing. But Eleanor, standing nearby, caught his words. She shook her head, her voice steady and clear. "It's never just a monument," she told him. "It's every boy who never made it home. That's why he stood there." The man lifted his eyes, a flicker of shame crossing his face. "No more," he whispered. In the control room, Captain Lee replayed the footage. The system had worked exactly as designed, flagging 2 men tied to a network active across Europe and the Middle East. Their goal had been simple: desecrate the tomb, capture the chaos on film, and spread it online, a strike aimed at America's heart. But they had not counted on James Whitaker. They had not counted on a soldier who had endured worse, who had carried a dying friend through fire, and who had sworn a vow he would never break. Lee leaned back, her voice low, speaking to the empty room. "Well done, Corporal." The story of that day did not spread through headlines or viral clips, but through the voices of those who witnessed it, shared in veterans' halls, in church basements, over coffee at VFW posts. They told of the sentinel who had stood against 5 armed men and held his ground. They spoke of the tomb, of what it meant to guard the nameless, to stand watch for those who no longer had a voice. In Ohio, James's home state, a group of veterans organized a bus trip to Arlington, bringing their families to witness the place where duty met danger. In Virginia, a woman penned a letter to her local newspaper urging neighbors to visit the tomb and see for themselves what it represented. In a quiet town in Pennsylvania, a retired teacher began a lecture series on Arlington's history, starting with the account of James Whitaker. James himself never heard these stories. He didn't need to. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows over the marble, he finished his shift. His steps remained precise, his rifle unshaken. The cut on his hand burned, the bruise on his shoulder throbbed, but his breath stayed even, his focus unwavering. His thoughts drifted to Daniel, the laughter they had shared in the barracks, the silence after the blast. He thought of the tomb, honoring soldiers without names, but whose sacrifice was eternal. This was why he stood guard, why he fought, why he returned to his post in silence. Walter lingered as the crowd thinned, his gaze fixed on James. He lifted his hand in a slow, deliberate salute, Marine to soldier, across decades of service. James could not break protocol to return it, but his eyes flicked toward the old man for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement. That was enough. Eleanor remained as well, her rose resting against the chain. She thought of her husband, of the men she had cared for in war, of the young guard who had stood so still and fought so fiercely. "We don't forget," she whispered, to no one and to everyone. This isn't just James Whitaker's story, or about 5 men who tried to defile sacred ground. It is about every sentinel who has ever kept watch, every family who has mourned, every visitor who has stood before a headstone and felt the weight of history. It is about the promise we make, to remember, to honor, to protect. So I ask you, have you been to Arlington? Have you stood before the tomb and felt its silence? Have you told your children, your grandchildren, of the soldiers who gave all? Share this story with them. Bring them here. Let them see what duty looks like, what sacrifice truly means. Because as long as we remember, as long as we stand ready, those who gave their lives will never remain unknown.